Welcome everyone to Cold War Spaces. My name is Anna Rose Canzano. I'm the Exhibitions and Programming Associate at the Wende. Thanks so much for joining us today. Today's topic is open space, radical women artists behind the Iron Curtain. And our guest is Susanna Altman. She's an art historian and independent curator based in Dresden. She studied art history and philosophy in Dresden and at the New School for Social Research. In addition to various curatorial and publishing activities, she focuses on art production in the former socialist part of Europe before and after 1989. She's the curator of the Wende's 2019 exhibition, The Medea Insurrection, Radical Women Artists Behind the Iron Curtain, which was an international collaboration with the Albertina Museum in Dresden. So today's program will be about a 30-minute conversation between Susanna and Joes Segal, the Wende's chief curator and director of programming. After that, we'll leave about 15 minutes for audience Q&A, so please get your questions ready to put in the Q&A box during that time. As always, we appreciate everyone's questions, but please keep them short so that we can try to get to everyone's. And as we're getting started, the chat box is open if you want to say hi and what city you're tuning in from. And we'll be posting the recording of this program on our Vimeo page later today if you'd like to go back and share it with anyone who wasn't able to make it. And lastly, I'd like to thank Susan Horwitz and Rick Feldman for generously supporting discussion series at the Wende and our virtual programs. And now Joes will get us started with the conversation. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Anna Rose and Susanne. Welcome to Cold War Spaces. So great to have you back after our visit at the Wende Museum, where you were the mastermind and organizer of the Medea Insurrection exhibition, which Anna Rose mentioned, which in fact was a groundbreaking exhibition, the first time that on a large scale, the role of women artists in the unofficial or countercultural art scenes in Eastern Europe was really highlighted. So my first question to you is, how would you explain that it took so long for the significance of these women artists to be recognized?
First of all, thank you very much, Joes and Anna Rose and the team for having had me and the Radical Woman and for having me again today. Yeah, even through Zoom, it feels like coming home a bit.
Perfect.
And the question is one that could make me angry, and because it's a big burden to shoulder, bringing these women artists to the light after having been kind of invisible for many years before 1989, but in a very inexplicable way also for decades after 1989 in their respective countries to a varying degree. And I'm not sure why this is. I think one reason comes from the involvement of critical feminist art history relatively late, and even for the artists themselves, like for these women artists, it must have felt strange or funny to be only recognized for being a female artist. So I mean, if I was an artist, I would also be suspicious and say, well, it's my artistic qualities with which I want to be recognized. So maybe this also kind of retarded the course of recognition. But the recognition of female artists is deeply embedded in the recognition of art from the former Eastern Bloc after '89 in general. And while countries like Poland, Hungary, Czech Republic, Slovakia, and so on have done a great deal of establishing a kind of, in the best sense, national art historical narrative after '89. There is even a different picture with East German artists, be it women artists or or artists in general, because the perspective of recognition, hope, and yeah, hope for acknowledgement and so on was always directed westward, because art history was written in the West, and with the two and then reunited Germanys, it was even trickier or more difficult to unfold a new narrative or to insert certain positions into the canon.
Yeah, I can imagine also because, of course, the GDR was the only former East European country that ceased to exist.
That's true, and I'm actually, and I still think this is a problem for the artists, because some of them, and rightly so, have not understood that in their mature art production, they share a lot more with the former Eastern colleagues than with the Western. And this is not a deficit. On the contrary, this is kind of an enrichment, and but this needs to sink. Unfortunately, these artists are pretty old and
Right.
may die before they even understood how unique and specific and innovative their work actually was.
Which is why it is so important what you have done, both in terms of research and your exhibition. Would you say that looking at the works of women artists from these unofficial backgrounds, there are some significant differences between male and female artists?
Yes, but this has to be handled very cautiously, because on the one hand side, we want to, meaning art historians and feminist art historians like me, want to establish a narrative which is on one level of quality, right? Mm-hmm. So it's very difficult to say, as for instance, I was pretty disappointed that my great role model, Piotr Piotrowski from Poland, has kind of pressed in women artists in one category of his research, that is kind of the body and performative work, as if women artists only had to contribute works that deal with the body or transgressions between performative work and theater, or I don't know. That was a little bit, that was hugely disappointing. And this is why I really try to empirically, which is not quite cleanly academic, but I try to empirically identify aspects where women artists really have contributed something, like aesthetically and conceptually. And this is why I came to the major conclusions I made while curating the exhibition and after having curated it, and when assembling the catalog, because this then somehow these major achievements fell into place.
Right. So can you mention a few aspects you think are particularly significant in the work of women artists?
Yeah, I think the in different media, like photography or experimental film, these women artists have a different approach, because they focus on the body, mostly on the female body, but with a huge portion of humility and trust and confidence between themselves and the depicted subject. So it's like with a classical feminist art history writing or reading, it's not the male gaze, it's the female gaze that is automatically in action. Automatically, I say, because in many circles, pre-1989 circles, there was no feminist literature, or almost no feminist literature around, or like theory building. So a lot of these approaches, like how you deal with the body, and how the body and the skin is the last territory where state can't follow you, is something that comes out of intuition.
Right, I see. Yeah, no, that makes sense. Many of the countercultural artists, male or female, were active under the radar in cultural centers like Berlin, Leipzig, Prague, Warsaw, Budapest, you name it. But you became especially interested, I think, in art projects that didn't take place in the cultural centers, but in the open sky. That's why we have the title of our program today, the countryside, in nature. Can you tell us what attracted these, in this case, women artists to work in these remote circumstances?
Yeah, and that's also something I didn't focus on at the beginning. I didn't really identify it as something special. It really ordered itself in front of my eye while working on the project. And I found out that relatively many of like East German female painters sought refuge in the countryside around Berlin. So if I pay studio visits to these elderly ladies, today I travel to little villages north and south and left and right of Berlin, and learn that they settled there, let's say in the 70s and 80s, as a very conscious and not easy decision to not participate in the urban environment of, let's say, Berlin. It's really particularly in the Berlin environment, but also spoken and unspoken, of course, they were not so easy to be observed by the cultural, whatever, politician or
Right.
agents. So.
Right. So I'm very curious, because you did research into different countries: Poland, Czechoslovakia, East Germany, Hungary, Romania. If you think there were some significant differences in the respective unofficial artworks, and maybe you can share some images while you think about it. Yeah.
I mean, yes. The differences, of course, were, and like my part of my mission, and that kind of relates to my own origin, is to pay more attention to under-recognized East German artists, of female artists of that generation. So I necessarily draw comparisons between the respective art scenes in Poland, Czechoslovakia, and Eastern Germany, and so on. And of course, I find differences there. So, for instance, the subversive art in Eastern Germany was still 90% related to painting, even if it crossed borders to experimental film or to kind of abstraction. It stayed relatively close to the human figure and to figuration, which is, for established art history writing, is problematic, because it's like often the East German art production of that time is quickly judged as figurative painting, but you have to look closer, I think, what happened to figurative painting and what risks these artists took. And on the contrary, or no, in comparison, you will have much more works of conceptualism, or the so-called neo-avant-garde, seriality, and geometrical abstraction in countries like Poland or Hungary or Czech Republic, Romania, where there were periods of thaw, so to say, at different degrees in different decades, and in that respect, yes, there are differences. Do you want me to share my screen now?
Sure.
Or is it
Yeah.
not yet?
No, I think this is a nice moment to have a look at some examples. Yeah. There we go.
Is that?
Yeah, and if you can make it full screen now.
Yes, I would love to, but you know what? The entire Zoom thing up here doesn't allow me to find the full screen mode. That's a pity.
Anna Rose, can you help out here?
You know, like the upper, I can't.
You'd be able to move the Zoom window.
Can I move it? No, I can't. So I'm so sorry. Thank you, Anna Rose. Sorry for being stupid. Now we should.
Okay, perfect.
Right?
Perfect.
Is it there?
Wonderful.
And I'm starting with these totally, not for Polish colleagues, of course. Hello, Polish friends. Unfamiliar name of Maria Waskievich, which was one of the inspirational, not necessarily teachers, but influences on Magdalena Abakanowicz with her experimental reading art, and as you can see, with her radicality in adapting vernacular references, like folk art references, and with these kind of abstract figures. And I think Maria Waskiewicz, you can see she became very old, and she was around for a long time. And she also worked, as you can see in the lower right corner, with abstract object, has been a major role model, I think, for artists that worked, female artists, but also male artists like Wojciech Sadley, that worked with textile technologies, and textile technologies in itself are very much related to rural culture, because it's like the weaving as a craft and as a pure necessity to generate clothing and warmth is still very more related to villages and farm life than to anything else. And we're talking about the 20th century now. So here we can, I hope we can see Magdalena Abakanowicz, who was also part of the Medea exhibition at her loom in the 1960s. And I think everyone would join me in saying that her decision to become a fiber artist was something revolutionary at that time. And I think there's a lot of influences that are converging in the second half of the 20th century when it comes to rural culture or vernacular aesthetics. I found this in an art periodical, Projekt, which was widely distributed in the Eastblock as well, because it was at a certain point it was bi or even trilingual. So here you see a typology of scarecrows assembled by researchers that were close to contemporary art at that time. Here also the quality of object art, environmental art, and kind of abstracted figuration that fascinated these artists. And when we look at how Magdalena Abakanowicz in 1968 presented her textile objects woven from very also unusual materials like rope and sisal and horsehair, you name it, you can see that this aesthetics of the open space of presenting objects under the open skies, but also relating to the textile as an archaic means of fabrication, infuses her approach very much.
Yeah, it also feels very much like surrealist visual language, right?
Of course it does, and
yeah.
and actually the actual film, which is hard to get and complicated to show because of copyrights, gives you, along with the music that was especially composed for that film, gives you this kind of a surreal impression.
Right.
Yeah, in addition to the visuals. And to stay in Poland, there's also one artist who gained more recognition first in Poland and now worldwide during the last, let's say, decade, and rightly so. That is originally amateur photographer Sofia Ridak, and she made it a lifetime project, like a long-term journey to take pictures in the Polish countryside. First of all, because she was fascinated by visual culture, but also by the social qualities of living in the countryside of Poland, but also because she knew this was a world soon bygone, that was a vanishing world, and her body of work is so huge. And here I show you just one tiny segment of a village by the name of Salipia, where she found these wonderful ornaments, which is in a way serial minimalism, like this kind of repetition of forms and so on, which might certainly has fascinated her. Yeah, and it's a unique record of this visual culture, but also of people. And,
right.
she was also very much focused on women. So her cycles, record sociological record, is consists to huge parts of peasant women within the confines of their estate, on thresholds, inside the rooms and so on.
Right. Susanna, with an eye on the time, can you maybe say something about the projects of Sargova and Lubash?
Yes.
Yeah.
And here we see Natalia LL, also in the early form of spiritual environmentalism in Poland, where she melts into the nature. And speaking of melting into the nature, we have this wonderful, unfortunately deceased Czech artist Zorka Zaglova, who was active before and after the Prague Spring. And this is a work from after the Prague Spring, where artists circles, and she belonged to the circle of Carter 77 artists and this rock band Plastic People of the Universe, who kind of fostered their dissident spirit in the countryside, in villages, and they did hiking tours and they made performative project. And here you see Zorka Zaglova with the work Laying Out Naples at Sudomierz, where she relates to an old Czech narrative of a village that where the troops of the emperor were defeated by tricking them women tricking them into flight by laying out nappies and irritating, confusing the horses. And it's like in this dire time of so-called normalization, which was just an increasing of restriction after the Prague Spring, this gives a wonderful metaphor and also hope for Czechoslovakian people at that time, that this tyrants can be defeated ultimately,
right.
which they did.
Wonderful.
And here we have, and this is, we take a leap to Romania, work of Ana Lupa's Humid Installation, 1970, same time, different circumstance, because the Ceausescu hardships were not quite implemented that totalitarian at that point in Romania. But it's more interesting how Ana Lupas here consciously collaborated with peasant women in a certain village and establishing, of course, this kind of running fence like avant les lettres installation with bed linen and clotheslines, which is also this decidedly female occupation. But she also describes this as a first conscious participatory project. She doesn't use the peasant women as kind of stagehands, but she really forms a collective with them in a time where, to be honest, to be part of a collective was not very desirable, speaking of a socialist totalitarianism. And right. Yeah, and she also did other project where she used rural technologies such as hay and straw, and kind of really discovered this entire material atmospheric inspiration of the vernacular countryside. Sure.
Right. Thank you, Susanne. And okay, maybe yeah, this is a great maybe final example you can say something about. Yeah.
As in the beginning, we talked about these East German artists who established their artistic and social life on little villages around Berlin. We have the farm cottage of Erika Stürmer-Alex here in the background, who moved out there in the 1980s and really rebuilt this complex from the scratch with her own hands, or with the help of her female companions. And then after she kind of finished, or halfway finished, she started to invite female artists for weekends, for performance weekends, for partying, also a very early form of LGBTQ encouragement, whatever structures. And here we see young women from Erfurt, Thuringia, who traveled halfway across the GDR to participate in a weekend of performance at Erika Stürmer Alex's cottage, and they pose here in the whatever wheat fields in their masks and costumes.
That's wonderful. Yeah, maybe we can go back to speaker's view, and I will ask you one final question before we go to the Q&A, because I'm very curious. You mentioned that by leaving the city, these artists also freed themselves, relatively speaking, from strict control. But then on the other hand, how did they find their public? And how did they reach out to people actually to be aware of what was going on?
I know. I also had, I didn't have to learn it, because I really grew up in GDR and in kind of Semitic subversive culture circles until I was 25. So the question of the audience was not the question of concern. It was very important to express yourself for the moment, and if only 10 people saw it, then the word was spread. Other colleagues and artists would hear. I mean, the Secret Service also, the Stasi would also hear about it, but it was first and foremost a gesture, and not grapevine, but how the message that you could do something different. And of course, there were networks where you invited people and printed little like lino cut invitation cards and posters. And so it was not insignificant, the question of audience, but you wouldn't expect it and you didn't like live for it.
Right.
You would demand something that was impossible.
I get it. Thank you. Yeah, we have already a lot of questions under the Q&A. So please, if you have questions, type them not under the chat, but the Q&A box, which is where I'm looking. And the first one is by Bruce Hollihan. It seems to me, he writes, that avant-garde and underground artists succeed in the creation by being under the radar, in a manner of speaking, whether in Cold War context or otherwise. Do you know if artists, female and male, are experiencing any kind of difficulty or suppression in places like Poland and Hungary from ruling parties such as the Polish PIS party and the Hungarian Fidesz party, so the right-wing populist movements right now?
So this is a question of the present?
Yeah, it is. Yeah.
Oh, yes. I mean, it has nothing really to do with my, to put it impolitely, with my topic now, but I still do a lot of research and traveling in these countries, especially where to put it mildly, where conservative powers are ruling. And yes, there are really restrictions for especially for Hungarian artists, censorship and cutting of funds, restructuring funding bodies and institutions where you don't execute open oppression, but through changing structures you can do a lot of harm. And then we have Poland, where a peace party and their bodies as the Catholic Church and stuff attempts that. But I would say Polish artists are still very belligerent and have a very good fighting spirit. So I like this because this reminds me of the times before '89, because the repression creates or brings forth new art forms or aesthetic answers to repression, and this I like.
Right, so in that sense, there's actually a continuity between the Cold War period and the current situation.
After a short, relatively short time of liberality and liberty.
Right. Next question is from Donna Stein. Was Anna Lupas aware of Christo and his environmental installations?
I don't know.
Okay,
I just don't. I just
that's a
don't
quick
know.
answer.
We looking at her work 1970. I'm not quite sure when Christo started with it. Romania in the 1960s was pretty progressive when it came to the permeability of borders to the west. So there was some input. It might have been, but on the other hand side, I think that what Anna Lupas created there as a collective sculpture is not beyond, but is something different. Not visually, but conceptually.
Linda Hahn asks, did these feminist artists suffer any political consequences as a result of their art?
Yes, but I also only have kind of some singular examples. For instance, the women artists group from Erfurt, Künstlerinnengruppe Erfurt, with spearheaded by Gabriele Stötzer, they were closely undermined and observed by the Stasi, by the secret police. And as I'm just preparing an exhibition about this particular group with 4 colleagues, we have access to these Stasi files, and it's horrifying, actually.
Right, and Gabriele Stötzer actually spent time in a Stasi prison, right?
But that was before. That was in 1976 for a political action a purely political action that she took that was not related to art.
I see.
But actually, I'm not very knowledgeable when it comes to Poland, let's say in the martial law time, but I'm pretty sure that there were restrictions after in those years of 1981 to 83, but I'm not sure whether they were implemented particularly because of gender, questions of gender or so. I think this was an overall phenomenon.
Right. Next question is by Nadeshta Sultanova. What was the reception of these works from the artistic society on both sides of the Iron Curtain? Were they available, be it as mere rumor, to the Western world? Did they influence some more mainstream artists on the Eastern side?
Difficult question, because again, even if I do these kind of shared, or I apply this shared perspective, as I said, the repressions, or like openness and repression in different parts of the Eastern Bloc varied from decade to decade. So I know that in the 1970s, the conceptual art in neo-avant-garde, including women artists like Alina Shapochnikov, for instance, there was a great and fruitful exchange with the West, particularly with France. And same applies to one decade earlier with Romanian artists. And but there's one thing about, I'm very sure that as East German artists, be it male or female, were hardly known outside of Eastern Germany, either on the west side of the border nor on the east side. So that there is unfortunately no influencing on a greater scale. There is influencing like when I think of Christa Jeitner, the fiber artist from Germany, who had very close contacts to Polish fiber artists such as Wojciech Zadlej, and I think they're in like a micro perspective, you can see influencing and mutual cross fertilization, but on a larger scale, I'm now.
Okay, thank you. Yeah. Robert Adantos writes, were art history and theory books and other resources that existed before the Cold War confiscated and unavailable to Eastern Bloc artists?
Also, I think Polish artists had good access to theory and literature in the 1970s, as did, I think, Romanian artists in the 1960s until the early 1970s. Czechoslovakia in before the Prague Spring, so in the short 1960s, and in Eastern Germany, it was pretty. It was difficult. There were libraries even at the art academies, where like enrolled students and the teaching body could access them. They only had to know that they were there, and confiscation of art books was not as widely spread as confiscation of, let's say, political theory books or news magazines or so. But the point is, you, as having matured in these years, you had to know what you wanted to read or what you wanted to have, and then you had to have a network where I don't know, where you could find people who would smuggle stuff in, and some grandmothers did.
Right. Okay. Next question. This is a great one, I think, by Anna Horakova.
Ah, Anna, ahoy.
She writes, in the GDR, younger female underground artists, such as Gabriele Stützer, were at times mentored and protected by loyal dissidents, such as the official East German writer Christa Wolf. Were there similar networks at work in other contexts in Central and East in the Eastern Bloc? And how might it complicate a stark divide between official and underground cultures?
This would be a wonderful research, Anna, that that will have to be done. Of course, there is this really a famous story of young Gabriele Stötzer having been taken under the wing of Christa Wolf, who also happens to be the writer who kind of translated feminist theory of the 1970s into East German or Eastern literature. So this is, I mean, this is such an overpowering example that all of a sudden I can't think of anything else. But what I know is that especially when in Poland in the 1980s, when the intellectuals of the Solidarność movement, or the after the Prague Spring, the intellectuals and writers of the Charta 77 and this circle kind of joined forces with artists that I don't know whether there was a mutual protection, but there were fusions and between authors and poets and philosophers and visual artists. And Václav Havel, for instance, wrote about Magdalena Jettilova in the 1980s, I think. And when it comes to official culture, to be honest, Christa Wolf is also not a very striking example for an official artist in a way. So I think there were, or at the Leipzig Art Academy, there were established artists like Bernhard Heisig, who protected and promoted young, wild, experimental guys like Hartwig Ebersbach. I mean, there were. Thank you, Anna, for for pointing this out. This opens a very wide field of whatever thinking, inspiration.
Yeah, and I think it's a great point also that even looking at official or so-called unofficial art, there are so many gray zones and so many ambiguities if you approach it like that. The next question is from Adele Mike Dietrich Friedetsky. Thank you for the talk.
Hello.
What kind of focus are you working on concerning the Erfurt group? And when and where is the exhibition going to be shown?
The exhibition is going to open on, I think, November, and we all hope physically, November 22nd or so at the Neue Gesellschaft für Bildende Kunst in Berlin, NGBK. And we are a collective of women, 4 or 5 women curators, identified by Gabriele Stötzer herself. She kind of banded us together without, there was no saying no to her. And we will really trace their experimental work. And it's very, I think for us, it's very important to point out that avant-garde art before 1989 does not only consist of neo-conceptualism or neo-avant-garde of Poland or Hungary or so, but also has deep roots in the radicality of these artists who work in performance and transgressive media.
Right. I guess we have time for one final question, which is by Robert Adanto. Are there any well-known female artists who made official art in the GDR or other East Bloc nations?
This is a topic that my dear colleague April Eisman would be knowledgeable of. As I said, art in the GDR has a lot to do with figuration and with painting to various degrees. And I think that Angela Hampel, and mostly Angela Hampel is an artist where you can't really say this is official or unofficial, because we're talking about the 80s and a relative an opening of cultural policies in the GDR. So Angela Hampel, although their contents are forceful and also belligerent and defiant, but she also made her way, even before the wall came down, into the Western or the international conscience. And then we also have Cornelia Schleimer, who emigrated in the to the West in the 1980s. So, and also we have female painters like Nuria Quevedo, or to a lesser degree Heidrun Hegewald, who also interpreted figuration and, in a way, social criticism in their own very unique way.
Right. Susanna, I want to thank you very, very much for this talk. It was so informative and you were so passionate. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you very much on behalf of my troupe of wonderful women artists.
Great. So I have to apologize as always for the questions that couldn't be answered because of the time. Next week, we have our next Cold War Spaces interview with Jenny Anderson, who is a researcher at the Department of Social Anthropology at Stockholm University, professor at the Center for European Studies in Paris, and co-director of the Max Planck Sciences Po Center in Paris. And with her, I will talk about future studies and futurology in the Cold War in East and West. She wrote a fantastic book called The Future of the World. So please join me next week for that interview, and I wish you a wonderful week.